In England, around 1 in 8 men have a common mental health problem, but to what extent do societal expectations prevent men from seeking the support they need? To help us understand this question, earlier, Lookout spoke to Judith, a researcher from Southwell Union, and asked her about one of the historic case studies that she's been looking into.
So he was born in January 1858 in Lamley, which is a village in Nottinghamshire. Most of the people at that time that were living in Lamley were framework knitters. He comes from a family of framework knitters. There was framework knitters that were workers, and then there was people that owned the frames and therefore rented them out. I'm wondering as to where on the pecking order this family was. Basically, his mother died in childbirth. So to me, that's when the family started to go awry. The daughter found the father, and he tried to hang himself on his bedpost with his braces. So I've actually got a clip from a newspaper record, and it sort of says Lamley attempted suicide. This quiet village of Lamley was on Tuesday morning thrown into a state of confusion by a report that Thomas Newham, a framework knitter in the village, had committed suicide by hanging himself. And so that's how the report starts. When his wife died during her childbirth, it left him with a family of 5 young children. And he was gradually sunk into a desponding, they call it, desponding state of mind, and at times seemed so much depressed as to be quite unable to follow his daily employment. And so he tried to commit suicide, and then he got taken away. And you can imagine these children seeing his father being taken away. On being discovered, he was sent to the Union Workhouse, and then from the Union Workhouse, they then sent him to the asylum. It says they admitted him to the Union and kept under proper control. Then I find him admitted in February to the Sneinton Asylum. We have no idea what was happening to the children at this point. I assume most of them were living with their grandparents. Levi will potentially have gone himself to the workhouse because they decided he was workhouse material rather than living with the family. When he was actually in the workhouse, he wasn't that little. When we found him in 1871, he was 13. In those times, 13 wasn't considered a child as such, even though down on the records it says deserted child. His father is living as a lodger in Burton Joyce, and he's living in a pub. So between the ages of 13 and 19, he was living in Burton Joyce with his father. Not only was Thomas doing framework knitting, but he was opening a book. Basically, he was taking bets on the races, foot races, and so he was making his money from that. Basically, what we think took him over the edge was that he'd gone up to the races and lost a lot of money. According to the inquest records, it looks like he'd spent more time running the book than he did framework knitting, even though Levi was probably framework knitting from home because he would have been working on the loom, perhaps at home, whilst his dad was doing whatever his dad was doing. He went to Radcliffe-on-Trent, which is across the river from where he lived. He went to the pub, had a drink with somebody, had a conversation with somebody, then came out and literally shot himself. In the language of today, we actually use the term taking his own life. But in the past, they used to say that it was committing suicide. That's why a lot of the phrases from the newspaper reports that I've found use that phrase. Levi would have heard this at the inquest, and the coroner said the deceased appeared to have been a weak-minded man who either could not or did not choose to struggle against misfortune and trouble. The letter that was shown in the inquest was of Thomas's own hand, and this is just a phrase from it where he said, "I declared that I have not done anything of late, and that I have no cause to feel the least remorse of conscience. Every morning it is wonderful how bad I feel, and I feel as though it is impossible to get up. I have borne it till my life is that miserable that I can bear it no longer. And as I was afraid I should have to go into the asylum again, I have done, and I want no ceremony over my grave. Make a hole and put me in it and cover me up." And I'm just thinking how Levi must have felt to have heard those words and how he must have felt standing there. In the report of the inquest, it actually states that it was obvious that Thomas felt and was very loving towards his son, Levi, and didn't get married. He stayed in the workhouse. He's in the punishment book. He assaulted an old man, aged 78, and he was taken to the lockup. And then they obviously thought it was serious enough because they took him before the JPs, and he was given 14 days hard labour in the House of Correction, which is sort of like the prison at Southall, as it was then. When he appears again further along in the punishment book, again he'd assaulted another old man, and that was 9 years later. What made him angry enough to assault this old man? The massive trauma of losing his mother, post-traumatic stress disorder. We're finding more and more out about that now and how that affects a person. It's so easy to put a person aside. We need to look at each individual as an individual, not to put them as a group, and try and find out as much about that person and what makes them tick, what makes them work, and what's best for them. From the research that I've done, I found men committing suicide was actually quite a common thing. If they felt they were unable to look after their families or felt that they were unable to look after themselves, they thought the right way out was actually to end their lives. Yes, Thomas did go to an asylum, but it was more of a disgrace if it happened to a man. Seeking help was seen somewhat differently in the times of Thomas and Levi. You didn't seek help. Single-family dads have got just as much to offer. We're not that different as people. We're not that different, really. It's just our attitudes that should change, and it's important that they do change.